Thank you, everybody. So once again, my name is Noah, and I work at the Mowat Centre. The Mowat Centre is a public policy think tank at the University of Toronto's School of Public Policy and Governance. So that basically means that our job is to do research on public policy issues that matter to Ontarians and Canadians. That's all I'll say as far as my infomercial for my employer goes. I'm going to try and keep this relatively brief and informal. Because I'm going first, though, here, I'm going to try and offer a bit of a definition for the sharing economy. And I'm going to start by acknowledging that the definition of sharing economy can be a fraught one, and I just want to move past the debate of whether Uber is part of the sharing economy because it's not truly sharing and it's really ride for hire. You know, that's a legitimate debate to have, but when we talk about the sharing economy broadly and the issues that it brings up, I think we can move past those definitional issues for today. In the common usage, when we talk about the sharing economy, we usually talk about two different kinds of business models, and these can overlap quite a bit. It can be sharing our assets rather than owning or traditional rental of assets. So that can be sharing your home through Airbnb, or sharing the Bike Share Toronto, what used to be called Bixie Bike, or Zipcar, or Car2Go. These are shared pools of assets. And we also talk about peer-to-peer transactions like your UberX, like Airbnb, like Borrowwell, which is a peer-to-peer lending platform. So what all these sharing economy platforms have in common is a really strong technological component. This is a technologically driven development that we're seeing. Because driven by this technology, enabled by these technologies, should acknowledge that peer-to-peer transactions in themselves are in no way new. But why we're talking about it here tonight is the scale of this change. And this scale is moving really quickly. And I present on this a fair bit, and every 2 weeks my slides are completely out of date. To give you a sense of that scale, I think it was in 2013 or 2014, Airbnb was boasting that they had 1 million properties on their platform, which is pretty significant. Hyatt or Hilton, they're around 200,000 rooms worldwide. By this year, there was at least one night where Airbnb had 1 million guests staying in Airbnb rooms in one night. So this is how quickly things are moving. The reason this is able to move and the way this technology plays in is that the technology allows the transactions between peers to be frictionless, safe, easy, a good experience. And the fact that it's based on technology means it's easy for these platforms to expand rapidly. There's no need for physical infrastructure for Uber, Airbnb when they enter a new city. They can have 1 to 2 staff covering a region. And when we talk about the sharing economy in our work at the Mowat Centre, we generally talk about 5 sectors. So we talked about Uber and Airbnb already, and I'll probably lean on those as examples. But beyond transportation and accommodation, there's peer-to-peer retail, like Etsy and Craigslist and eBay, peer-to-peer services, like TaskRabbit, and peer-to-peer finance, like Kickstarter and Borrowwell. But we're here tonight to talk about why should you care. That's the theme of this event. So, I mean, as Allison mentioned, this is something that's happening and transforming our economy. To me, why we should care from a public policy standpoint, because that's my job and the lens I'll bring, is the sharing economy offers both opportunities and challenges. And the role of our governments and the role of our public policy should be to maximize those opportunities and minimize those challenges. So in the next few minutes, I'd just like to talk quickly about what some of the bigger public policy issues are, from my perspective, that are raised by the sharing economy. Why responding to this kind of change can be so challenging for governments, and some thoughts about how this can present a broader opportunity for us to modernize the way we do public policy and government. So when we talk about policy challenges in the sharing economy, we're usually talking about some of the issues in these specific industries, whether it's the taxi and limo licensing rules in Toronto, or whether Airbnb rentals should have to register as bed and breakfasts. And these issues are interesting on their own. But I think there are some broader picture issues that we can talk about here and I think they all boil down to the blurring lines between what's personal and what's business or commercial. So, I mean, that in itself, the question of what's the right threshold where we should be regulating or government should be getting involved. And this involves acknowledging some things that we don't usually talk about. We talk about our regulation for food safety as if it applies evenly across the board, but we also subtly acknowledge that we're usually not sending the Toronto Public Health to the child's lemonade stand on their driveway. I mean, you occasionally see in the news an instance where health inspectors got sent to a kid's lemonade stand, but we accept that we're not sending, tax inspectors or building code inspectors for the retail rules for a garage sale. There are a lot of things that we accept fly below the radar or fall under different rules if they're personal, not commercial. But the sharing economies really starts to blur those lines. And that means that the whole way that we've designed our regulations and our laws and our bylaws, we need to rethink that. There's also a case where we need to simplify a lot of our rules because somebody who's renting out their home 10 days a year on Airbnb when they're away on vacation shouldn't be expected to follow and understand 7 pieces of legislation in Ontario around running hotels or bed and breakfasts. So that first theme is sort of thresholds for regulation. Big policy issue here also is competition. So a lot of our rules are in competition. The question about competition is about having a level playing field. So there's going to be a balance point here between making sure that there's not what we consider unfair competition from, say, an UberX driver not having to follow the same rules as a taxi driver, but also making sure that we're allowing and encouraging competition that is good for us as consumers and allows for innovation. Sharing economy raises questions about consumer protection. So a lot of these sharing economy platforms and marketplaces, they have their own systems of consumer protection, their own guarantees built into the company's platforms, but especially they're based on these rating systems in many cases. You rate your Uber driver, they rate you. You rate your Airbnb host, and they rate you. That can actually do a pretty effective job about ensuring consumer protection in most cases, but we have to ask questions about how well these systems work, and do they leave some groups behind? Are some people getting discriminated against? Do we need special consumer protections for vulnerable groups, for people with disabilities? And then one of the most interesting areas that we're seeing in terms of questions around the sharing economy is what it means for labor markets and labor rules. So it's raising these questions if you're a driver under Postmates or a driver on Uber, are you an employee of the company? Well, not quite, because you're choosing to operate your own business through this app. But it doesn't quite look like our idea of an independent contractor either. So neither of these systems provide probably the right kinds of protections or the right level of regulation. They raise questions, can we come up with a new set of rules that fall somewhere in the middle? And finally, just because I want to not just focus on the negative, there's the opportunity here for innovation, to start new companies that create jobs, to start new companies and services that allow you to make more money by renting out your home, by renting out the power tools that you have in your garage that you use once every 3 years, or if you're like me, never. And allowing consumers to get better deals and more options. So that's got to be a consideration for our policy considerations more broadly. So another reason we're here today is that we have to acknowledge that this is a really challenging question for governments. We have a system that's not really that well designed to respond to these kinds of developments. And I say that about the sharing economy in particular because that blurs those lines between the personal and commercial. we have a tough time responding to these fast-moving technology developments more generally. Just tell two quick stories here, just to illustrate how long this has been an issue. In 1783, I'm going to go way far back, Paris, France, were the lead up to the French Revolution. That's about the extent of my history knowledge. We had the first hot air balloons take off. By 1784, the government of Paris, in the midst of the conditions that were leading up to the French Revolution, decided it was a priority for them to ban all hot air balloon traffic because of the menace this was going to pose to society. This was new, it was scary, we didn't know how to respond, so it was a threat. I say we, putting myself in the same category as 1783 France, but this was this immediate response. We didn't know what it meant, so we banned it. We can also have more constructive and long-lasting responses to new technology than we recognize they raise new issues. The whole idea of privacy, as we talk about it today, the right to privacy, we have a privacy commissioner at the Ontario level and at the federal level. A lot of that comes from some work that Louis Brandeis, who later became a Supreme Court justice, did in response to the first Kodak cameras. So there's this new, the early cameras, you had to stand there waiting for a picture. There wasn't a lot of risk that someone was going to take a surreptitious picture of you without your consent. But now with these new handheld, reasonably cheap cameras, people could be taking pictures of you without your consent. People could be taking pictures on the beach in your swimwear. And this was a new question for people. So this whole idea of a right to privacy is in response to the idea of being photographed. And that's a new idea that's been evolving for the last 120 years or so. And I bring up both of those examples because it's pretty hard to tell what the impact of a technology in our society is going to be. If it's hot air balloons, it could be pretty innocuous, a way to enjoy yourself on vacation, or the idea of being able to be photographed and the right to privacy and security turned out to be a pretty long-lasting and important issue. Just to mention that we often criticize governments for moving slowly on these issues, but some of the reasons it moves slow are institutional. We expect in a democracy that our governments, the people that we elect, are going to have time to evaluate and to weigh in on legislation, and that means you have to have committee hearings, you have to have public consultations. We expect that aspect of democracy to work, but then we criticize our governments for moving too slowly. And we also create a political culture that punishes governments for getting things wrong much more than we reward governments for getting things right in response to promoting innovation. There's some really asymmetric incentives there. And so if we're creating a system of incentives where our governments, whether public servants or politicians, are going to be afraid of that front page that Ashley might write the next day, then we have to keep that in mind about what that's giving us in terms of response to innovation. And of course, the sharing economy itself moves so quickly. It's growing so quickly, and it's so decentralized, and it's operating on a global scale. So what Toronto or Ontario or Canada might do to respond, we may not have as much choice when norms are being set at a global level. So I'm optimistic here. I think we can take the opportunity here to actually end up with a better and more responsive and modern way to regulate and have policy for lots of things. We can have more flexible approaches to regulation that build in the lessons we can get from two-way reputational ratings. Well, maybe that's a simpler way of doing 80% of the work of consumer protection, and we can use that data, and we can focus more on the role for government. We can learn from the way that these platforms and companies operate, from using data really effectively, using our assets more efficiently, so they're finding our unused assets and making use of them across government. And we can think about, the sharing economy is really driving a conversation, as I mentioned, about those, the labor markets and what it means to be an employee or a contractor. And that's helping us to understand some of these questions that are happening across the labor market, like contract workers or outsourcing. While I've pointed out how much this is a challenge, I would like to leave with one thought. It's important for us to figure out how to get this right, because while we're spending time right now arguing about who's appropriate to drive the car in an Uber X or a taxi driver, car manufacturers and technology companies are working really hard on developing driverless cars that can be on the road in a couple of years. That's a fascinating opportunity, but it's going to be a lot harder to work out the implications of that than it is the issues we're dealing with the sharing economy. So we really do have to get better at responding to these changes that are happening as a result of technology. So with that in mind, I'd like to let other folks have a chance to talk.